The snow had been falling for 3 hours by the time Nora Briggs pushed through the front door of Crossroads Diner. Not gently, not the way people in movies push through doors with their hair catching the light and the world slowing down around them. She pushed through it the way she did everything, with one hand braced on the wheel, the other driving forward, her jaw set, her eyes already scanning the room for the table she wanted. Corner booth, away from the door, good sightlines. She had learned to want good sightlines the same way she had learned everything useful in her life, not from a book, not from a class, but from paying attention to what happened when you did not have them. She had been coming to Crossroads for 2 years, ever since her mother started pulling double shifts at the Maverick station 4 miles down Route 3. The drive between the gas station and the diner was exactly 6 minutes on dry roads longer in snow. June Briggs had walked it twice in the past 8 months, when the truck needed repairs they could not yet afford and the roads were too bad for Nora to manage alone. Nora knew this because June had never mentioned it. She had figured it out from the timestamps on her mother's texts when she was en route, and from the particular redness of June's face when she arrived on those nights, the specific coloring of someone who had been outside in the cold longer than a parking lot walk required. The diner was warm. The coffee was bad, but it stayed hot, and nobody here had ever once tried to help her with anything she did not ask for. That last part mattered more than the coffee. Outside, Billings, Montana had gone the color of old pewter, the kind of February night that made the highway look like it ran off the edge of the world, like if you drove far enough you would simply run out of road and keep going anyway, into the dark and the cold and the nothing beyond the mountains. Inside, the diner smelled like bacon grease and burnt pie crust, and the particular warmth of a place that has been heating the same air for 40 years. A warmth that settles into the walls and stays there through everything, through the hard winters and the slow summers and all the ordinary human business that accumulates in a place where people stop because they need to. Every window was fogged with the breath of tired people who just wanted to sit somewhere warm for a while. A man in a Carhartt jacket nursed black coffee at the counter. He had the particular stillness of someone who has nowhere to be and has made peace with this, who has discovered that having nowhere to be is not the disaster it once seemed. Two older women shared a piece of coconut cream pie 3 booths down, talking in the comfortable, unhurried way of people who have known each other long enough that they do not need to fill every silence with something. A woman Nora did not recognize sat alone in the far corner with a tablet propped against a water glass, typing slowly with 2 fingers, her reading glasses pushed up into gray hair that had once been red. She was not eating anything. She had the particular quality of someone who was used to being in rooms without being of them, who had spent a long time learning how to be present and invisible simultaneously, and had gotten so good at it that she did it now without trying. Nora took her corner booth. She settled the brake on her chair, unzipped her jacket with practiced efficiency, and pulled the sketchbook from the bag slung across the back of her wheelchair. The sketchbook was not new. The cover was black canvas, soft from handling, with a spiral binding that had been bent slightly out of shape and then bent back again more times than she could count. There was no name on the cover. There did not need to be. It had been hers for 3 years, which meant it had been everything for 3 years, the place where she put the things she could not say and the things she could not stop thinking and the things she did not yet have words for but needed to put somewhere before they became too heavy to carry. The inside front cover had her father's handwriting on it, 4 words in the neat compressed hand she had memorized without trying, to the way children memorize the handwriting of people they love, absorbing it the way they absorb everything that matters to them without deciding to. It said, "For the road ahead." He had given it to her in the hospital 3 days before she was discharged. She had not used it until she came home, until the night she sat on the floor of her bedroom because the bed was too high and she had not yet figured out the transfer, and she needed somewhere to put what her hands were trying to say. She opened it to a fresh page. The waitress, a woman named Paulette who had worked Crossroads since before Nora was born, appeared without being called. She set down a laminated menu that Nora never looked at and a glass of water. Nora always drank and then stood with her order pad in a posture that said she had all the time in the world, which was the specific gift of a woman who had been doing this long enough to know that rushing people never actually saved time. That patience was not a virtue exactly, but a form of efficiency once you understood what the job was really for. Nora glanced at the menu anyway. Her eyes went to the milkshake column first the way they always did, found chocolate 425, then moved to coffee 175, and she closed the menu. Coffee, please. Just coffee. Paulette did not write it down. She had not written anything down in 30 years. She just nodded and walked back toward the counter, and Nora opened her sketchbook and picked up her pencil. She began to draw. It started the way it always started, with the wheel. Not a motorcycle wheel specifically, not yet just the arc of something circular, something in motion. The feeling of a thing that was built to move and knew it, that had been designed from the inside out around the purpose of going somewhere. She had been drawing motorcycles since she was 6 years old. Her father had taught her, not formally, not with lessons and technique, and the careful scaffolding of formal instruction. Just by sitting beside her at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings, with a mug of coffee in one hand and a pencil in the other, drawing shapes and saying things like, "You see how the engine sits here, how everything balances around it like a spine, like a body that knows what it was made for." She had not understood at the time that he was teaching her to see structure, to look for the thing a thing organized itself around, to understand something by finding its center and working outward from there. She understood it now, and understood also that the teaching had not stopped with motorcycles, that it had been going on her entire life in the space between what he was saying and what he was showing her, in the gap between the lesson and the thing the lesson was for. That was what she missed most, not the big things people always assumed she would miss, not the holidays or the milestones, or the occasions that were supposed to matter because someone had designated them as mattering. The Sunday mornings, the pencil in his hand, the way he would hold a drawing up to the window to look at the light through it like he was checking for some quality of truth that required illumination to verify, some honesty in the lines that could only be seen against brightness. The way he said her name when he was pleased with something she had drawn. Just her name, quiet, as if the pleasure was its own complete sentence that did not need any other words around it to mean what it meant. She was 13 when he died. She was 13 when everything else happened too, but the dying was the part that did not stop. The other things had edges, beginnings, and endings you could locate in time that became past tense eventually and stayed there. The dying just kept being true every morning. You woke up and it was still the first fact, still the thing that all other facts organized themselves around, the most persistent truth in a life that had become, in many ways, organized around its persistence. The wheelchair had come from the accident. The accident had come from a Tuesday night in November when her father was driving her home from a school concert. She had played violin second chair, a piece she had practiced for 6 weeks and played adequately, if not beautifully, and a pickup truck ran a red light at the intersection of Broadwater and 27th, doing 53 miles an hour. She knew the exact speed because it was in the police report, and she had read the police report because she was the kind of person who needed to know the exact shape of things that had happened to her, who could not rest inside not knowing, could not accept the shapeless version when the precise version existed somewhere and could be found. The doctor said Daniel Briggs died on impact. They said it in the way doctors say things, which is clearly and quickly and without looking directly at you, as if the truth is a thing you can hand someone and then step back from, as if the handing is the entire transaction, and what the person does with what they have been handed is entirely their own business. They said Nora was lucky. She did not feel lucky. She felt like someone had reached into the center of her chest and taken something load-bearing, and everything that had been resting on it was now just sitting in a pile waiting for someone to figure out what to do with it. She spent a long time waiting for someone to figure that out before she understood that the someone was a her. The spinal cord damage was at T11. The physical therapist explained what that meant with a diagram and a careful voice and a specific quality of professional kindness that Nora had come to understand was a cultivated skill, something practiced and maintained the way you maintain any tool you depend on. And Nora had listened and nodded and asked one question, which was whether it was permanent. And the therapist said yes with the kind of gentleness that means yes. And Nora had nodded and thanked her and went back to her room and did not cry until she was alone in the hospital bathroom at 2 in the morning, with the lights off and the door locked and the water running so no one could hear. She cried for 40 minutes. Then she washed her face. Then she went back to bed. She did not cry in front of anyone after that. Not because she did not need to, but because she had understood something specific about her situation, which was that she was going to need to be capable of things, and she was not going to be able to be capable of things if she was constantly being looked at by people who were worried about her and needed to be reassured. She needed them to be reassured so they would stop looking at her so carefully, so she could do what she needed to do without an audience watching every moment for signs of something going wrong. She had been managing it mostly. Fine was a word that covered a large and complicated territory, but she had been managing the territory well enough. The coffee arrived. You sighed. Paulette set it down without a word and was gone again, and then 3 seconds later, she was back setting down a chocolate milkshake that Nora had not ordered. The glass was cold and sweating slightly in the warm diner air, and a long paper straw was angled in it at precisely the right height for someone sitting in a wheelchair. Paulette had figured out the right height 11 months ago and had never gotten it wrong since. Paulette, on the house. The woman was already walking away, her orthopedic shoes making the small squeaking sound they always made on the linoleum. You want pie? Nora looked at the milkshake. At the careful way it had been set precisely in the center of the placemat, not shoved to the side, not set carelessly, but placed with the specific attention of someone who knows that the manner of a thing is part of what the thing is. No, thank you. She picked up her pencil and kept drawing. What she drew that night, like she had drawn almost every night for 3 years, was not just a motorcycle. It was a scene, a figure large and broad, built like someone who had never once walked away from something because it was hard. The figure had its back to the viewer always because she could never quite see the face clearly, could never render it in a way that felt honest and true rather than made up and false. But the posture was unmistakable. The figure was standing in front of something between something and the world. Arms slightly out, not aggressive, not threatening, just present. The specific posture of someone who has decided to be somewhere and means it completely without condition or caveat or the possibility of being otherwise. Behind the figure, barely visible, was something smaller. A child, maybe. She was never entirely sure what it was or why it was there or what the large figure was standing between it and she just kept drawing it, kept returning to it, the way you return to a question that has not been answered, but feels more important with each, asking more urgent, more like the thing that all the other questions were circling around all along without being able to say so directly. She had been drawing this picture for 3 years without knowing who it was. She had drawn it in the margins of her school notebooks and on the backs of receipts and here in the sketchbook, where most of her serious work lived. She had learned not to question the things her hands wanted to do because her hands were sometimes ahead of the rest of her, and it was better to let them lead than to stop them and lose whatever they were reaching for. She was 40 minutes into the sketchbook, 4 pages in, when the door opened and the 3 of them came in. She noticed them the way she noticed most things, peripherally automatically cataloging without meaning to. 3 young men, college age, the kind of loud that comes from having never had to be quiet in a room where something else was happening that mattered more than they did. Ski jackets in colors that cost money. One of them, the tallest, had the particular walk of someone who had always been the biggest person in whatever room he was in and had organized his entire understanding of the world around this fact, had built his personality on top of it, the way you build on a foundation, so that removing the foundation would require demolishing everything above it. He scanned the diner when he came in, and his eyes moved the way a searchlight moves, not looking for anything specific, just sweeping the available territory to establish that he was there, and that everyone else should register it. His name, though Nora did not know this yet, was Cody. Cody Baxter. He played lacrosse at the State University 40 miles north of Billings. He had his father's chin and his father's eyes, and though people said it less often and never to his face, his father's specific quality of entitlement, the kind that does not know itself as entitlement, because it has never once been placed in a situation that required it to justify its existence, that has grown up inside the assumption that this is simply how rooms work and how people in rooms behave toward people like him. The other 2 were Reese Holden and Fletcher Vance. They had been following Cody since the 9th grade with the comfortable loyalty of people who had decided early that it was easier to orbit someone confident than to develop confidence yourself. They were not bad people exactly. They were people who had not yet been placed in a situation that required them to be good ones in a way that cost something real, that demanded something from them beyond loyalty to someone who was already going to be fine. They took a table 3 down from Nora, not the corner, The center of the room, which was where people sat when they wanted to be seen being in the center of the room and wanted everyone else to know that this was where they chose to be. She went back to her drawing. The pencil moved along the line of a gas tank. She was rendering an older model, something from the late 80s, the kind of bike her father had described to her so many times. She could close her eyes and walk around it in her mind, touching each part in the sequence he had taught her. He had owned one once before she was born. A 1987 Harley-Davidson Softail, dark blue with chrome details, which he said caught the light differently depending on where you were standing and what angle the sun was coming from, and which he discussed with the specific quality of attention that meant he had actually stood in many different positions and observed this carefully, that it was not a figure of speech, but a literal description of something he had done because the bike was worth doing that for. He had sold it before he married her mother. He said some things belong to one season of a life and not another, and you have to know which things those are, or they stay past their time and become something heavier than they were a burden, where they used to be a joy. But he had never stopped talking about it, and she had never stopped drawing it, and sometimes she thought that the drawing was a kind of keeping, that you could keep something by rendering it precisely enough, that the line on the page was a form of holding. For a while, the three young men were just noise in the background of her concentration. Loud ordering. Something dropped and laughed about. The word dude used 11 times in 4 minutes, which she counted, not because she wanted to, but because her brain did things like that, collected numbers, kept tallies, noticed patterns, whether she asked it to or not. It was the same part of her brain that had memorized her father's encoded alphabet without knowing it was an alphabet, that had drawn the same mysterious figure for 3 years without being able to name it. Then the noise shifted. She felt it before she could name it. A change in direction, like wind rotating before a storm. The volume stayed the same, but the target changed, and suddenly the laughter had a point, and the point was close. Her. She did not look up. She was very good at not looking up. She had developed this skill over 3 years of being someone who attracted a particular quality of attention in public spaces, the attention that comes from being visibly different in ways that make certain people uncomfortable, and that discomfort makes them need to do something about it. Say something, establish some relationship of superiority to the discomfort by directing it outward, making it someone else's problem. She had learned to let the first wave of it pass without engaging, because engaging with the first wave usually invited the second, and the second was always worse than the first would have been on its own. Hey, this was Cody. She could tell from the voice the same searchlight quality applied to sound, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard and not particularly interested in whether you want to hear him. Hey, are you drawing motorcycles? She kept her pencil moving. I'm talking to you. She looked up then, not because she felt compelled to, not because she was afraid of what would happen if she did not, but because she had decided to. There was a difference between those two things, and she had learned to know it precisely to locate the difference in herself before she acted, because the action that comes from decision is different in quality and consequence from the action that comes from reflex. She met his eyes evenly. He was standing now half out of his seat, leaning toward her with the casual confidence of someone who expected the world to lean back in whatever direction he leaned. Yeah, she said. He glanced at his friends, grinned. Why? Because I want to. He laughed. His friends laughed. He slid fully out of his seat and walked toward her, and she watched him come, and she did not move, and she did not drop her eyes, and her pencil kept moving on the page for another 3 strokes before she set it down with the deliberateness of someone who is putting something down on their own terms and not because they have been made to. He stopped at her table, looked down at the sketchbook. Something moved across his face when he looked at the drawings. Something that might have been in a different person on a different day, something close to genuine appreciation. The drawings were good. She knew they were good. She had always known this with the clear-eyed self-assessment of someone who had put in the hours and had the evidence of what those hours produced. But then Reese was behind him, and Fletcher was behind Reese. And whatever had moved across his face closed back up, and the other thing returned, the thing that had been there from the beginning, the thing that was always looking for somewhere to land. These are actually kind of good, he said in the specific tone of someone who has appointed himself to hand out assessments of other people's work. I know, Nora said. The grin faltered slightly. He picked up the sketchbook without asking. She felt the loss of it in her hands like a small amputation, the sudden absence of something that had been there. Cody, she said. She did not know his name. She said it as a stand-in for what she meant, which was put it down. She said it the way her father used to say her name when she was doing something that needed to stop. Not angry, not urgent, just certain with the specific quality of someone who has already determined what is going to happen and is extending as a courtesy the option to happen differently. He flipped through the pages. Fletcher leaned over his shoulder. Reese made a noise that was shaped like a laugh, but was not exactly. She's obsessed with bikes, Reese said, and his finger turned a page without asking, leaving a smudge on a drawing she had spent 2 hours on a detail she had gotten exactly right after 4 failed attempts. A detail that required exactly that quality of attention and care and the willingness to fail 4 times before arriving at the true thing. Nora set her pencil down on the table. Carefully, precisely, with a flatness in her expression that was not blankness. Blankness is the absence of something, but was instead the presence of a decision being made in real time, the internal architecture reorganizing itself around what needed to happen next. You ride, Cody asked, and then looked at her chair, and then laughed. It was not a big laugh. That was the specific thing about it, the thing that made it what it was. It did not need to be big to do what it was designed to do. Small cruelty is efficient. It accomplishes the same result with less visible effort than cruelty that announces itself and waits for a response. Give it back, she said. Just that. 3 words flat and certain, and the temperature in her voice dropped to something that in a different situation with a more perceptive person would have been the end of it. Would have been the moment the other person assessed what they were actually dealing with and made the correct choice. Cody Baxter was not a perceptive person in that particular way. He was a person whose perceptions had been organized around a set of experiences that had not yet included the specific experience of being wrong about which room he was in and who he was dealing with. He pulled the sketchbook slightly back when she reached for it, a practiced movement, the kind performed so many times that it had stopped feeling like cruelty and started feeling like a game, the kind of game where only one person knows the rules and finds the other person's confusion entertaining rather than sad. She reached again. He stepped back. The edge of his hip caught her milkshake glass, and it went over the cold, dark chocolate spreading across the table and into her lap. The cold, immediate, and spreading and impossible not to feel. The sketchbook went with his startled movement and fell open on the floor, pages splaying in one page. The first drawing she had ever made in this sketchbook. One from the floor of her bedroom at 3 in the morning, on the night she came home from the hospital, the one she had never finished because she could never see the face, caught on the spiral binding and tore at the edge. The sound it made was just paper, small and immediate, and then gone. But she felt it in her hands, in the place where the pencil usually rested, the specific loss of something that could not be exactly replaced. The whole diner had gone quiet. The clink and murmur of silverware and conversation had simply stopped away. Sound stops in a room when everyone in it realizes at the same moment that they are all witnesses to the same thing, all being asked without words what they are going to do about it, all holding the answer for a moment before doing whatever they were going to do. Nobody moved. The man in the Carhartt jacket looked at his coffee with the focused attention of someone who has decided that his coffee is the most important thing in the room and requires his complete concentration. The 2 older women with the coconut cream pie found something on the table to study with great interest. Paulette stood behind the counter with a dish towel in her hands and her eyes down, not because she was cruel, but because she was 61 years old and tired, and this was not the first time she had watched something wrong happen and felt the full weight of the distance between what she wanted to do and what she knew how to do. In the far corner, the woman with the tablet and the gray hair looked up from her screen. She looked at the table where the milkshake had fallen. She looked at Nora. She looked at the tablet propped against the water glass where the camera on the front face had been running since she sat down, as it always ran when she was somewhere that felt like it was about to become something worth having a record of. Dorothy Greer had spent 31 years developing the instinct for rooms that were about to change, and she had felt it when she walked in 40 minutes ago, the specific atmospheric quality of a room on the verge of something. She did not look away. Cody was saying something, an explanation that was not an explanation, the verbal version of hands raised to indicate accident, while the eyes indicate something else entirely. Fletcher had laughed and then stopped laughing and was now doing the very specific expression of someone who urgently wants to not be present for what comes next, but does not know how to remove himself from it. Reese was looking at his phone, which in 2024 is the modern equivalent of looking at your shoes, and serves the same function, which is to indicate to the room that you are not technically watching what is happening and therefore cannot be held responsible for your presence in it. Nora was not looking at any of them. She was reaching into the bag slung across the back of her wheelchair with the focused calm of someone who made a decision 3 seconds ago while everyone else was still processing the previous moment. She had been ahead of them since the milkshake glass fell. Her fingers found her phone. She pulled it out. Cody's student ID card had fallen from his jacket pocket when he stepped back from the table. It lay on the floor 6 inches from her left wheel, except clearly legible in the diner light. His name, his photograph, his university seal, very clear. She took the photograph without obviously aiming. She had aimed before she raised the phone the way her father had taught her when he was teaching her photography on an old film camera he had bought at a garage sale when she was 9 years old. He had said, aim with your eyes first, then with the lens. By the time you raise it, you should already know what you're getting. One image, clear, time-stamped automatically. She opened a message thread to her mother's number and typed 3 lines. Not a cry for help, not a panic message. 3 factual lines, precise and specific, the kind of record you leave when you want there to be a record, and you do not yet know what form the record will need to take or who will need to see it. She attached the photo. She sent it. She set the phone face down on the table and looked at Cody. You should go sit down, she said. No threat in it, no anger performed for the room, just the statement of someone who has assessed the situation and stated its most logical next development, who is offering information rather than demanding anything or asking for anything. The voice of someone who has already decided what is going to happen and is noting it for the record. Something crossed Cody Baxter's face. Not quite recognition, not quite discomfort, something that did not have a name yet in his vocabulary because the experience that would have given it a name had not yet happened to him. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Reese. Then he set the sketchbook on the table. Not threw it, not placed it carefully. The complicated middle position of someone who needs to put something down, but cannot figure out what posture to take while doing it. What face to wear while making the choice to stop. He went back to his table. Paulette came with a cloth and cleaned the table in long, steady strokes, working from the spill. Outward, the way you work from the center of a problem outward, establishing cleanliness as you go. She did not look at the 3 young men. She brought a new milkshake without being asked, set it down in the same careful center of the placemat, and was walking away before Nora could say anything about it. Nora picked up the sketchbook. She smoothed the torn page as flat as it would go, which was not flat at all. The crease was permanent. But she pressed it anyway, her hands flat on the page, the way you press your hands on something to establish contact with it, to say, I am here. I know you are damaged. I am not leaving. She looked at the drawing on the torn page. The big figure. The child barely visible behind. The space between them she had never been able to fill in. She picked up her pencil and kept drawing. That was when the sound began outside. It started at the very edge of hearing the way distant things do when they are still far away, but moving in your direction. A low-frequency hum, not thunder because thunder is random and uneven. The sound of something breaking, and this sound had structure. It had a rhythm that was almost biological, almost like breathing, except that it was many things breathing together, coordinated and continuous. It was the sound of engines, many of them, and it was moving south along Route 3 toward the diner, and it was getting louder in the particular way of things that are not going to stop. 1 engine, then 3, then a number that stopped being countable and became instead a single continuous resonance that pressed against the fogged windows of Crossroads Diner and made the glass vibrate at a frequency you felt in your sternum before you heard it with your ears. The physical reality of sound as a matter moving through matter, as something large and purposeful claiming its place in the air. Every head in the diner turned toward the front windows. Through the condensation and the falling snow, you could see the shapes arriving in the parking lot. Dark and chrome in the cold one by one, filling the available spaces and then spilling onto the road's shoulder, a row, and then another row, and then more beyond that, their exhaust rising white into the winter air above them. leather jackets, heavy boots, the particular faces of men who were not trying to look dangerous and did not need to try, who had arrived at whatever they were through a long process that had nothing to do with performance. Iron Veil MC, all 34 of them returning from a memorial ride for a brother they had lost in December 40 miles north, stopped at Crossroads because the snow was getting serious and the diner had good parking, and because sometimes you stop somewhere for no reason that feels like a reason at the time, only understanding later what the stop had been for all along. Cody Baxter at his center table had gone very still, in the specific way that certain people go still, when they realize for the first time in their lives that they are in a room where their particular quality of confidence does not function the way it usually does, where the usual mechanisms do not apply. The diner door opened. He was not what you would call imposing in the theatrical sense of the word, not the kind of large that announces itself and waits for applause. He was large the way certain landscape features are large, the way a particular ridge of mountains is large, as if height and density had simply accumulated in that form over decades without being arranged there by anything other than the basic physics of what he was and what his life had asked of him. 59 years old. Gray beard that had been gray for a long time, a face constructed feature by feature over many years by weather and loss and long stretches of silence and occasional violence, and the specific texture of a life lived mostly in the spaces outside the places where ordinary life is supposed to happen. His name was Garrett Donovan. People in Iron Veil called him Ironback, a name that had come from 7 months in a military hospital in Bethesda, Maryland in 2004, in the titanium hardware now occupying the space where 2 vertebrae used to be. He walked without a limp, which 3 different doctors had independently told him was not going to be possible. He did most things they had told him would not be possible. He had long ago stopped being surprised by the distance between what experts predicted and what turned out to be true, particularly when the prediction involved what the human body could and could not endure when the person inside it had decided what was going to happen. He stepped inside. The 33 men of Iron Veil came with him, filling the doorway, spreading into the room in the slow, unhurried way of people who are entirely comfortable with where they are and have nowhere else urgently to be. The diner was theirs simply by virtue of them being in it. No one had said so. It did not need to be said. Garrett did not look at the 3 young men at the center table. He looked at Paulette first, who was standing behind the counter with her dish towel still in her hands, and he looked at her the way you look at someone when you want the truth and have no patience remaining for anything that is not the truth. "Who scared you?" he has said. Not a question. The distinction matters considerably. A question opens a door and gives the other person the option of walking through it or not. What Garrett said was a request, and the difference lived in the particular weight of the last word, in the way he was already watching where her eyes wanted to go and was simply asking her to let them go there. Paulette's eyes moved, just briefly, involuntarily, the small movement she had been working to prevent since the moment the milkshake fell. They went toward the center table, toward Cody, toward Reese, toward Fletcher, who was now finding the napkin dispenser very interesting. Garrett nodded very slightly, barely a movement at all. Then he turned and walked to the corner booth. He stopped beside it and looked down at Nora. He looked at the milkshake stain on her jacket, at the table edge where the cloth had not quite reached, at the sketchbook lying on the table with its torn page visible at the edge of the spiral binding. He looked at all of it the way someone reads a scene moving backward through the evidence to reconstruct the event that produced it. Then he looked at Nora. She looked back at him. There is a particular quality of eye contact between 2 people who are not trying to win anything from each other and are not afraid of what the other might see. It is rarer than it sounds because most eye contact is negotiation of some kind. For status, for safety, for the establishment of boundaries, for the management of what you reveal and what you conceal. This was not any of those things. 2 people looking at each other with the specific directness of those who have been shaped by the same forces and recognize this in each other before they can name what they recognize, before they have the information that would explain the recognition. He reached down and picked up the sketchbook from the table. She let him. She watched his hands on it. Large hands scarred across the knuckles in the pattern of long worked in cold weather with metal and machinery that does not forgive inattention. The particular scarring of someone who has spent years doing work that requires precision and endurance simultaneously. On the inside of his left forearm, in old black ink gone slightly blue, At the edges with age was a tattoo she recognized without being able to say why. The way you sometimes recognize a word in a language you did not know you had been learning, absorbing it through exposure over time until it is yours before you have formally claimed it. He turned the pages. She watched his face. Not the drawings, she knew the drawings. She watched his face move through them, the way a landscape changes when weather is coming in from the west. The gradual shift of something being encountered that was not expected. Something registering that did not fit the predicted shape of the world and was requiring the world to adjust around it. His expression did not collapse dramatically. It changed the way temperature changes slowly and then completely. And you notice not the change itself, but the difference in quality between what was and what is now. He came to the last pages of the sketchbook. She had drawn the Iron Veil logo on the second to last page. She had drawn it from memory building outward from the central shape. The iron veil across the skull's face, the specific weight of the wings extending from the crossbar, the curve of the lettering that most people would not know was slightly different in the real version from the version available to civilians on merchandise and online. What she had drawn was the real version, the one that existed only in memory and on the skin and leather of the men who had been in Mosul in the summer of 2004, when the unit lost 4 men in 4 days. And the survivors had decided afterward to put the grief somewhere visible, somewhere permanent, somewhere you could point to and say, this is what it cost. These are the people who paid it. This is the mark we carry because of what happened there. Garrett's hand went still on the page. He held the sketchbook open to that drawing, and he was very quiet, and the diner was very quiet around him. And outside, 33 engines held their collective low note steady and continuous. Where did you get this drawing, he said, not accusatory. Not demanding. The voice of a man who suspects the answer and needs to hear it spoken, because some things require the air between people to become real, require the breath and the sound and the space between one person and another to make them true. Nora looked at the drawing. My dad showed me. He drew it for me when I was little. He said it was from a long time ago, and it meant something about people who stayed when they could have left. Garrett looked at her. Your father's name, he said. Daniel Briggs. What happened then was not a performance. Garrett Donovan was not a man who performed things. What happened was genuine and private, even though it occurred in front of a diner full of people, because genuine things have a quality of privacy to them, even in public, a quality that distinguishes them from the things that are meant to be watched, that makes witnesses feel they are seeing something real, rather than watching something staged. And every person in that room registered the difference without being able to explain what they were registering. He stepped backward. One step. The step of a man who needs more space around something than he currently has, who needs distance to see what he is looking at clearly. He stood with the sketchbook in his hands and was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the 33 engines held. The snow came down past the windows in long slant lines, white against the dark. Then Garrett Donovan pulled out the chair across from Nora's booth and sat down. He set the sketchbook on the table between them. He looked at his hands for a moment, at the scarred knuckles and the old ink on his left forearm. Then he looked up. Your father carried me out of a burning vehicle outside Mosul in 2004, he said. I had 3 broken ribs and shrapnel in my back, and I could not stand up on my own. He carried me 400 yards through open ground to a position where the medics could reach us. He lost his grip the first time and fell, and he got back up and went back to me, and he was hit with debris on the second approach, and he carried me anyway. Shaking the whole time. I could feel it through the whole carry, the shaking in his arms and his chest. He was scared, and he came back anyway. That was the thing I thought about most afterward. Not that he was brave, that he was scared and he came back. Nora was very still. He asked me one thing afterward, Garrett said. We were sitting in the medical tent, and he was getting his shoulder stitched, and he looked at me and said, Garrett, if something happens to me, you know my wife and my little girl. He showed me your photograph. He kept it in his chest pocket next to his heart, not the expression, the literal location. You were 6 years old in the photograph. You were sitting on a motorcycle with a helmet on that was at least 2 sizes too big for your head. You were grinning. The helmet was sliding down over your eyes, and you were grinning anyway. She remembered that day, the helmet sliding down, her father's hand tilting it back up, the sound he made when he laughed, which was a sound she could still hear perfectly if she tried, and which she tried to hear as rarely as possible because it was the kind of thing that could undo her if she let it, that required careful management to live with. I said yes, Garrett said. I made him a promise. He did not look away from her. He died in November 2021, and I went to the funeral and I stood at the back of the room and I looked at his photograph on the casket and I told myself you were all right, that your mother was managing, that you did not need a stranger showing up at your door with nothing to offer but a debt he owed and 3 years of delay on it. He paused. I told myself that for 3 years. I found every version of the story that let me not come. I was very thorough about it. He looked at her without looking away. I broke the promise I made to your father, he said. I am telling you that plainly because you deserve to hear it plainly, and because I have been carrying it for 3 years and the carrying has not made it lighter. And I understand now that it was not going to. Nora looked at him for a moment. Then she reached across the table and pulled the sketchbook toward her without breaking eye contact. She opened it to the first page, the first drawing. The big figure back to the viewer arms, slightly out, the child barely visible behind it in the space the figure was protecting. The drawing she had made on the floor of her bedroom at 3 in the morning on the night she came home from the hospital. The one she had never finished because she could not see the face. She turned it around and slid it across the table to face him. He looked at the drawing for a long time. I don't know who that is, she said. I've been drawing him for 3 years and I can't see his face. I just know what he's doing. She did not look at the drawing. She watched his face and it moved through something she did not have a name for, and the diner held its silence around them. And outside the engines held their note, and the snow came down past the windows, and the night was becoming something else entirely organized now, around a different center of gravity already moving in a direction that neither of them had planned for, but that both of them, in some way that preceded planning, that lived below the level of decision, had been moving toward for a long time. The door opened behind Garrett. June Briggs came in from the snow in her Maverick uniform with her hair wet and her eyes already scanning the room in the way that had been her first act in every room she entered since November of 2021. The continuous tracking of a woman who had learned that the world could rearrange itself without warning, and that paying close attention was not paranoia but the only appropriate response to that knowledge. She found Nora first. She always found Nora first. Then she saw Garrett Donovan. She had met him once, at the funeral. He had stood at the very back of the church with the careful positioning of someone who believes he does not have the right to be closer to the front, who has come because he had to, but is taking up as little space as possible, as if even his presence is something he is not sure he has the right to. He had not spoken to her. He had looked at Daniel's photograph on the casket for a long time, and then he had left without speaking to anyone. The exit of a man who came because he had to and left because he could not stay. She recognized him now, standing at her daughter's corner booth at 10 o'clock on a February night, and her face moved through several things in rapid succession and came out somewhere quiet and complicated. Not any of the simple emotions, but a compound of many things, some of which did not have names yet. She walked to the booth. She stood at the end of the table. Garrett had stood when she came in, which she noticed without acknowledging. He asked you to look after her, she said. Yes. 3 years, Garrett. Yes. She looked at her daughter, at the milkshake stain on the jacket, at the torn page in the sketchbook, at the cold coffee and the fresh milkshake, and all the evidence of an evening that had already been one thing and was in the process of becoming something else entirely. She looked at all of it, and then she sat down. Outside, the engines held their note low and steady, and the snow kept coming down past the windows, and the night had already changed its nature completely. June Briggs did not cry. That was the first thing Garrett registered about her sitting across from him in that corner booth, with the snow coming down outside, and 33 engines still turning over in the cold parking lot. He had expected tears or anger, or the particular blankness of a person who is holding everything so tightly it has changed the shape of their face. June did none of those things. She sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her and looked at him with the direct and level gaze of a woman who had spent 3 years doing everything alone and had become very precise at assessing quickly whether the person across from her was going to make things harder or easier. He recognized that gaze. He had seen it on soldiers, on people who had been in the field long enough to stop performing and simply be. The gaze of someone who has used up all the energy that pretending requires and has arrived at something truer and more useful on the other side. Nora was quiet beside her mother. She had closed the sketchbook and set it on the seat next to her and was sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes on both of them with a particular quality of someone who is taking in a great deal and releasing very little, storing everything for later use. Around them, the diner had recalibrated. The other customers had returned to their meals with the exaggerated normality of people who are very aware of what is happening in the room and are trying hard to demonstrate convincingly that they are not. Cody Baxter and his friends had left their exit managed so carefully it registered more as erasure than departure, here and then not without the usual noise of leaving. Paulette had brought coffee for June without being asked and had not said a word, which was exactly the right thing. The 34 members of Iron Veil were distributed through the diner. They were not loud. They were never loud in situations like this. Garrett had spent 26 years with men who understood that presence was the thing that mattered, that you did not need to announce it if it was genuinely there. June looked at him and said, "How much did he tell you?" "Enough. He talked about you and Nora the way men talk about the things they are most afraid of losing. Carefully, like saying it too directly might change something." Something moved across June's face that she did not allow to become anything visible. "That was him," she said quietly, "with the things that mattered." She looked at her daughter. Some communication passed between them that had no words in it, the accumulated shorthand of two people who have lived inside the same difficult years and developed a private language for what cannot be spoken out loud, a language made of glances and silences and the particular weight of things that do not need to be named because both people already know what they are. Nora said quietly, "Mom, show him." June looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she reached into the inner pocket of her canvas work jacket, the one with the broken zipper on the left side that had been on her repair list for 8 months. Meaning for 8 months, every single morning, she had put on the jacket and noticed the broken zipper and added fixing it to the list that never quite reached the top of the list, that always had something more urgent above it. And she pulled out an envelope. Not a new envelope. Time had turned it from white to the color of old piano keys, that slightly yellowed off white, that means something has been kept and handled and put back and kept again many times. The flap was still sealed, the glue holding after 3 years in a jacket pocket. There was no name on the front. Daniel Briggs had known when he sealed it exactly who it was for and had seen no need to write it. She set it on the table between them and pushed it slowly across to Garrett. He looked at it without touching it for a long moment. "He gave it to me in October 2021, June said, 3 weeks before the accident. He said, if Garrett Donovan ever comes to this house, you give him this. He said, if he never comes, you keep it anyway." She paused. "He didn't tell me what was in it." "You never opened it." "It wasn't mine." Garrett picked up the envelope. He opened it with the deliberate care of someone who understands that some things once opened cannot return to what they were before. That the act of opening is itself a change in the nature of the thing, permanent and irreversible. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper in Daniel's handwriting, the neat compressed letters of a man who had learned to write clearly, because in the field, unclear writing costs things that cannot be gotten back, and a small black USB drive held to the paper with a rubber band gone slightly brittle with age. He unfolded the paper and read it. He read it once without changing expression. Then he read it again more slowly. Then he set it on the table and looked at the dark window and the falling snow beyond it, and he was quiet for long enough that both June and Nora simply waited because the quality of his silence asked for waiting contained within it the specific weight of something being absorbed. The note said that for 14 months, Daniel Briggs had been keeping records. It said that Clint Baxter, chairman of the Billings Municipal Housing Oversight Committee, had been systematically falsifying safety inspection records for 11 residential properties he personally owned. Properties rented at full market rate to families who had nowhere else to go. Properties that had not been genuinely inspected in 4 years. Properties with exposed wiring and water damage in load-bearing structures and heating systems that cycled carbon monoxide into the upper floor apartments at night when the families inside them were asleep and trusting that someone had checked that the paperwork meant what paperwork is supposed to mean. It said Daniel had found out the way most true things are found out by being in the wrong place at the right time, with the kind of mind that cannot let a wrong thing go once it has seen it. He had been doing electrical repair work in one of Baxter's buildings when he found a file box in a utility closet that had no business being in a utility closet. He had photographed every page. He had gone home and sat with what he had photographed and understood what it meant and had not been able to set it down. It said he had contacted the Montana State Housing and Building Standards Division with an initial report in September 2021. He had been told the report was received and under review. He had heard nothing further. It said the USB drive contained everything: the photographs, the records he had kept of dates and buildings, and the names of the tenants who did not know what was in the walls of the places where they put their children to bed at night, who were paying rent for safety they did not have. It said, "I don't know if anything will happen with this. I don't know if I can make it happen alone, but people I don't know, and you know how to push on things that need pushing. And I trust you with this because of 2004, because a man who goes back twice when he could have kept walking is a man who knows what things are worth." It said, "Look after my girls, Garrett. That is all I am asking." Garrett folded the paper carefully. He put it back in the envelope and set his hand flat on top of it, and the weight of his hand on the envelope was the weight of a man who has understood something and is not going to put it down. He filed a report with the state, he said, before he died. "I didn't know any of that," June said. "He was protecting you. If you didn't know, Baxter couldn't come at you to get at Daniel. If there was nothing to find, there was nothing to use against you." June was quiet for a moment. "That's exactly what he would have thought," she said. Not bitterly, just with the recognition of a woman who had known a specific person well enough to understand his logic, even when he had not explained it, who could reconstruct the reasoning from the outcome. Garrett set the USB drive on the table in front of Nora. She picked it up and turned it over in her fingers, looking at it with the expression she used when she was looking at something she partly understood and was working out the remaining portion. "He had a system," she said, "for protecting information. He taught it to me when I was 8 or 9. He called it our alphabet. He said it was a game we could play, a secret code that was just between us." June went very still. "He substituted certain letters for symbols, not all of them, only the ones that mattered most. He had a key. He never wrote the key down anywhere because writing it down defeated the purpose." Nora looked up from the drive. "I have the key. He made me memorize it. He made it into a kind of rhyme so I wouldn't forget. I thought it was just something we did together, a thing that was ours." Garrett said, "He wasn't teaching you a game." "No," Nora said, "he wasn't." She looked at her mother. June had put one hand over her mouth and was looking at her daughter with an expression that contained several things simultaneously: grief and recognition, and something that sat in the territory between pride and devastation, the expression of a woman understanding that her husband had loved their daughter in a way that was also quietly and without announcement a form of preparation. He had been getting her ready for something he hoped would never be necessary. He had built the key into her memory like a gift wrapped inside an ordinary afternoon that had looked like nothing more than a father and daughter playing a game at the kitchen table, both of them happy, the purpose invisible. "I need a laptop," Nora said. One of the Iron Veil men, a quiet one named Dax Mercer, who had spent 18 years as a certified financial examiner before he stopped caring about offices and started caring about open roads, produced a laptop from a bag without comment. He set it on the table and stepped back. He understood his role in this moment, which was to provide what was needed and then not occupy the space where something more important was happening. Nora plugged in the USB drive. The files opened. Garrett looked at them across the table. They were on their surface exactly what they appeared to be: photographs of documents, inspection reports, stamps and signatures and compliance checkboxes, the ordinary paperwork of administrative process in a mid-sized American city. The kind of documents that exist in large quantities in filing cabinets and are rarely examined because they are supposed to be dull. And then he looked more carefully, and he saw what Daniel had seen. The dates did not align. Inspection reports dated to months when the access records, which Daniel had also photographed meticulously, showed no entry to the buildings. Signatures appearing on multiple documents in slightly different forms, the small variation that occurs when someone signs a name repeatedly, without the muscle memory of it genuinely being theirs when the hand does not quite know the signature it is performing. The same inspector identification number appearing on buildings 40 miles apart on the same calendar day. But there was a second layer in the file names themselves in the naming convention Daniel had used for each saved image. In that naming convention was the second language, the one that only Nora could read. She worked quietly. She had pulled a pen from her bag and was writing in the inside back cover of her sketchbook, translation lines, symbol to letter, building the decoded text one character at a time. Her handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of someone accustomed to working in the margins of things with limited space and no room for ambiguity, for whom precision is not a preference, but a necessity. June sat beside her and watched and did not speak. Garrett watched Nora's face as she read through the decoded material. He had been in enough high-information situations to know the difference between the face of someone understanding something for the first time and the face of someone having something confirmed that they had already suspected. Nora's face was doing the second thing, not surprised, arriving, coming to rest on something that had been waiting for her to get there. There are names, she said eventually, tenants, apartment numbers, what he personally observed in each unit. He was building a testimony record. He wanted witnesses from inside the buildings, people who could say what they had seen with their own eyes. She turned a page in her translation. He also has Baxter's signature on a document authorizing an inspection that never happened. The inspector he cited, a man named Gerald Fossey, died in August 2021. She paused. The inspection is dated November 2021. She looked up from the sketchbook. My dad died in November 2021. Nobody spoke. He must have found this right before, she said. He was trying to get it somewhere safe before he could do anything else with it, before he could get it to the right people. Garrett looked at the envelope on the table. He thought about Daniel Briggs in October 2021, 3 weeks before the accident, sealing an envelope and handing it to his wife with instructions for a man who might never come. He thought about the kind of mind that does that thinks 3 steps ahead, even inside everything else that is happening, that prepares for contingencies it cannot see yet, because the alternative is leaving things unprepared. And some things are too important to leave that way. He thought about 3 years. The envelope in June's jacket pocket, taken out and put back, never opened because he never came. He said, I need to make some calls. Dax Mercer was already moving before the sentence finished. Wade Flynn set down his fork and nodded. Wade was a large and quietly competent man who had spent 11 years in structural contracting and could walk through a building and tell you in 40 minutes everything it was hiding. The damage in the walls, the compromise in the foundation, the places where what the building claimed to be and what it actually was had diverged. Harlan Boone, a former licensed contractor with 22 years of Montana building code, memorized in precise detail, pulled out his phone without being asked. Garrett went outside to make the calls. The cold came at him from all sides, and he stood between the rows of parked bikes, exhaust long, cooled chrome, going dark in the winter air, and called each man in turn and told them what Daniel's files contained. He told them what he needed from each of them specifically. Each one said yes, without hedging, without conditions, in the direct way of people who have decided what they are about and do not require the situation to be simpler than it is before they agree to be part of it. When he came back inside, Nora had finished her translation work. She had set her pen down and was sitting with her phone in her hands, looking at something on the screen, with the focused expression of someone thinking about a next step in a sequence they have already mapped. The woman in the corner, she said when Garrett sat down. She was recording. He turned, Dorothy Greer's corner. The tablet still propped against the water glass, the woman herself watching without the pretense of not watching. I noticed her when I came in, Nora said. The tablet was on and angled at the room. I wasn't certain the camera was running, but I was aware of the possibility. And the angle was right for everything that happened. Garrett looked at Dorothy. Dorothy looked back at him with the calm and faintly amused expression of someone who has been in considerably more difficult situations than a Montana diner on a cold February night, and who is not going to pretend she doesn't know exactly what is happening. Dorothy Greer, she said before he could ask. Billings Gazette, 31 years, retired 2019. She looked at her tablet. The camera was running. It captured everything. He looked at Nora. That's yours to decide what to do with, he said, not mine. Nora looked at Dorothy. Does it show his face clearly? The student ID when it fell. Dorothy moved through the footage on her tablet screen. Both, clearly. Your photograph, the motion of you sending the text, his face, the ID on the floor. She paused. Your expression through all of it. Nora was quiet, thinking. Garrett had watched commanders think in the field. He had watched lawyers think in rooms where the thinking mattered significantly. He recognized the quality of focus he was seeing in a 16-year-old girl in a wheelchair in a Montana diner, and it was the same quality, and it did not require age or experience or institutional authority behind it. It required only the willingness to see a situation clearly and decide what needed to happen next without flinching from the decision or waiting for someone else to make it. "I want to send it to a local outlet," she said, with context, not just posted to social media, sent to a specific journalist who will handle it carefully. Dorothy said, "I know every reporter currently working at every outlet in this city. I know which ones are careful and which ones are not, and which ones Clint Baxter has bought lunch in the past 3 years." A pause. "I know one who hasn't had lunch with him. She's 26 years old and still angry about most things, which at this point in her career is less a personality trait than a professional qualification." "Someone who hasn't," Nora said. "That's the requirement. I have her. Her name is Sasha Holt." Nora pulled up her phone. She opened a new message and began composing a statement. Not to her mother this time. A different kind of document. She wrote factually and precisely a first-person account of what had happened in the diner that evening, with the photograph of the student ID attached, and a request that the context be included if the footage was used. She wrote it without asking anyone for input, without consulting anyone for wording, in the direct and unadorned voice of someone who has decided what is true and sees no advantage in obscuring it. She sent it to Dorothy. Dorothy read it, made one small correction to a date, forwarded it with the footage to Sasha Holt. Then she set her tablet down and picked up her water glass and looked at Nora with the expression of someone who has just seen something she is going to remember. Garrett watched all of it. He had gone outside to make the calls that were his to make. What Nora had done was entirely hers. He had not suggested it. He had not facilitated it. She had seen the piece, not facilitated it. She had seen the piece that belonged to her, and she had picked it up and acted on it with the efficiency of someone who does not wait to be given permission for the things that are already hers to do. He thought about Daniel, about the photograph in the chest pocket, the too large helmet, the Sunday mornings and the pencil and the private alphabet, and whatever it was that Daniel had been building in those ordinary moments, which was not a skill set exactly, not a list of capabilities, but something harder to name. A quality of character that knows itself and trusts itself and does not require external validation before it acts. That can assess a situation and decide and move without needing someone else to confirm that the assessment is correct. He had been coming for 3 years in his mind. He had been having this conversation for 3 years in all its possible versions, always arriving at the same place. He had never come because the coming required admitting the not coming, and the not coming had become, over those 3 years, the size of a thing he did not know how to carry into a room and set down in front of people. He was here now. That was the thing that was true now. He was here now and the work was starting, and the only thing to do with the years he had not been here was to let them be what they were and continue anyway, because continuing was the only direction still available. It was close to 1 in the morning when Dax sent a text from across the diner. 4 words found the financial thread. Garrett showed it to no one. He read it and set his phone down and looked at the falling snow outside and sat with the understanding that Daniel Briggs had started something in the last weeks of his life and had not been able to finish it, had built what he could build, had trusted what he had built to find its way to where it needed to go. It had taken 3 years, but it had gotten there. Nora turned the sketchbook around and pushed it across the table to him. The new drawing was quick, rougher than her careful work done in the fast, intuitive lines of someone drawing what they are thinking rather than what they are seeing. 2 figures this time, both large, both facing away from the viewer, standing side by side before open space that was implied rather than rendered the suggestion of territory ahead that had not yet been decided and was waiting for whoever was going to walk into it. She looked at him across the table. "My dad didn't wait for permission," she said. He looked at the drawing, at the 2 figures in the open space before them. "Neither do I," she said. He set the drawing on the table between them, and outside the snow was finally beginning to slow the flakes, thinning the dark between them, widening. In the weeks that followed the night at the diner, the Briggs house on Cascade Street became a different kind of place. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been obvious to someone who had not known it before. But the quality of the air in it changed the way air changes in a room when a window that has been closed for a longer time is finally opened. Not a flood of something new, but a slow exchange, the old giving way to something that had been waiting on the other side. June bought a second chair for the kitchen table. She bought it at the same furniture resale place where she had bought the table originally 8 years ago when she and Daniel had moved in, and the kitchen furniture they had been using since their first apartment was finally beyond what even the most generous use of the word serviceable could cover. She brought it home on a Tuesday and set it at the table without announcing what it was for. And the next Sunday when Garrett arrived, it was there, and that was all that needed to happen. Nora noticed. She noticed most things. She filed it away in the same place she filed everything that mattered. Not in words, not as a decision or a conclusion, but as a fact, the way facts about the world accumulate inside a person who pays attention, taking up the space they need, becoming part of the structure of understanding, without requiring formal acknowledgement. She had been spending more time in the garage, not because there was anything specific she needed from there, but because the garage was where her father had kept his tools and his materials and his projects in progress, and being in it was a form of being close to the way he had spent his time, the particular quality of his presence in a space that he organized around work. She had found the ramp lumber, of course. She had known about it before, had seen it through the years, had understood what it was and why it was there, and why it had not yet become what it was supposed to become. She had not been able to look at it for a long time. She could look at it now. She could look at it and understand it as something waiting to be completed rather than something that had been abandoned, which was a different relationship to it entirely. After the ramp was built, she went back into the garage more regularly, taking inventory in the slow way of someone who is learning what is there, what her father had kept, what he had accumulated over the years of doing the kind of work that required good tools maintained carefully. There was a lot. He had been meticulous about his tools. Each one had its place clean and organized, the kind of organization that comes from respecting what things are for. She found the sketchbook there on the shelf above where the lumber had been. She did not find it the first time or the second time she was in the garage. She found it on a Tuesday afternoon in late April when she was looking for something else entirely, when her eyes happened to land on the labeled edge of it on the shelf and she reached up without deciding to. The finding felt inevitable, the way some findings do after the fact, as if the thing had been waiting for the right moment to be found, and the moment had finally come. She sat in the garage for a long time looking at her father's drawings of her. She was in no hurry. The afternoon light came through the small garage window at a low angle and moved slowly across the floor while she sat and looked, and she let it move. She understood, looking at the drawings, something she had not had words for before. Something about the way love works between people who share a language that is not made of words, who communicate most truly through the things their hands make, who reach toward each other not through declaration, but through attention. Her father had been paying attention to her the way she had been paying attention to him. Both of them looking, both of them rendering what they saw into lines on paper, both of them keeping what they were looking at in the only way they knew how to keep things. The drawings were not finished, most of them. He had started many and not completed them. She understood this too, that the incompletion was not failure, but simply the nature of a thing done in stolen time, in the margins of the rest of life, in the Sunday mornings, before the coffee got cold and the day required other things. She had done the same herself, had begun more drawings than she had completed, had left half-finished pages scattered through the sketchbook, the way the half-finished things of a life accumulate waiting. She brought the sketchbook inside and showed June and showed Garrett, and let them sit with it the way she had sat with it in the garage. Then she put it beside her own sketchbook on the table in the corner of her room, where she kept her most important things, where the pencils were and the good erasers, and the small lamp that made the right kind of light for drawing in the evenings. 2 sketchbooks. 2 people who had been drawing the same thing from opposite sides. She looked at them side by side for a moment. Then she opened her own to a fresh page and picked up the pencil and kept going because the road went on and there was always more to draw. The video went live at 6:47 in the morning. By 7:15, it had 4,000 views. By 8, 19,000. By the time Nora woke on the couch with her phone buzzing continuously against the cushion beside her head, it had passed 100,000, and the voicemail was full of numbers she did not recognize. She lay still for a moment, listening to the house. Her mother was in the kitchen. She could hear the particular sounds of June making coffee. The cabinet, the drawer, the mug set down with slightly more force than necessary, The habitual announcement of a woman who had been tired for a long time and had developed small, unconscious ways of naming it without saying it. She picked up her phone. Sasha Holt had written it cleanly. A headline that said, "What happened," without dramatizing it. The footage from Dorothy's tablet showing the full sequence of events without editorial arrangement. The photograph of the student ID Nora's written statement printed nearly verbatim her own words in her own order. What the footage showed to the people watching it across the state and then beyond was not what they had expected when they clicked on a story about bikers at a Montana diner. They saw a girl in a wheelchair sitting alone at a corner booth, drawing, not waiting for anything, not asking for anything, entirely occupied with her own work. Three young men arriving, the escalation, the spill, the sound of something tearing, audible even on the tablet's small microphone. The silence of every person in that room. And then before anything external intervened, before the engines arrived outside, Nora, her hand moving to her bag, the deliberate photograph, the text composed and sent with complete calm, the absolute stillness of her face through all of it. Not the stillness of someone frozen, the stillness of someone deciding. The comment section, which Nora did not read, was very long. The calls she did not answer were from television stations in 2 cities, and a production company in Seattle, and a woman from a national news program who called back 3 times. The text from Dorothy, which she did read, said, "Sasha is getting calls. The student's name is out. People have connected it." The name being out meant Cody Baxter's name was public, which meant Clint Baxter was one search away. Nora set her phone face down on the cushion. She thought about Cody Baxter's name on the student ID on the floor of the diner. She had been thinking about it since she took the photograph, since she had gone home and searched it in the Billings municipal records that were publicly available on the city's website, and found what she had suspected she would find. She had not told anyone yet because she wanted to be certain before she said it. She was certain now. She had been certain since 11 o'clock the previous night. But certainty and the right moment to use it were not always the same thing, and she had learned to know the difference. She transferred to her chair and went to the kitchen. June was at the counter reading her phone with the expression of someone absorbing information faster than comfortable. She looked up. The two of them looked at each other in the way they had been looking at each other for 3 years, with the specific eye contact of 2 people who share a private understanding of what hard is and do not need to explain it. "Sasha Holt called," June said. "She wants to follow up. I'll call her back. Not today." Nora went to the cabinet for a mug. "Today I want to finish what we started with Dad's files." June was quiet for a moment. She watched her daughter reach up for the cabinet with the particular reach she had developed for high shelves, the economy of motion that came from 3 years of figuring out what worked. Then she said, "He knew what he was building into you. He just thought he was spending time with me," Nora said. "I think for him those were the same thing." Garrett arrived at 8:30 with Dax and Wade and Harlan. They came inside without ceremony and sat at the kitchen table, and June made more coffee, and they spread out what they had gathered through the night. Dax had worked through the night on Daniel's financial photographs. What he had found was not one fraudulent document, but a pattern, and the kind that only becomes visible when you lay everything in sequence and step back far enough to see the whole shape of it, the full architecture of what someone has built. Baxter had been filing false inspection certifications on his residential properties for 4 years. The financial benefit was not simply avoiding repair costs, though those were substantial. The actual mechanism was in the property valuations. Buildings with clean inspection records carried certified values that did not correspond to their actual condition. Against those inflated certified values, Baxter had executed a series of refinancing instruments that extracted Dax calculated with the precision of a man who had testified before federal courts on 3 separate occasions, between $800,000 and $1.2 million in lending, that the properties would not have qualified for if their true condition had been known to the lenders. It was not just cutting corners. It was a machine, a system designed and maintained over years. Wade had been at the first building on Daniel's list at 7 in the morning with a flashlight, a moisture meter, and 22 years of instinct for what buildings were hiding. He had been at the second building by 8:15. He set a yellow legal pad on the kitchen table. Both columns were full, and he had written small to fit everything. Harlan looked at the legal pad and looked at Dax's laptop screen and said, "This goes to the state enforcement branch." Not the review branch, not the county level, the enforcement branch specifically. Different supervisory chain, different personnel, no intersection with the county relationships, and simultaneously to the Attorney General's office. The financial piece is not a housing code violation. The financial piece is fraud. June said Daniel contacted the state, September 2021. His report is still there somewhere. Which branch? He didn't specify in the note. Harlan made a call. 3 minutes, efficient and brief. When he hung up, he said, Daniel's report went to the review branch. It is still technically active. It was never closed because the reviewing officer left a note requesting supplementary documentation before the case could proceed. That officer retired in February 2022. The file transferred to a new officer managing a backlog of 600 open cases. He looked at Nora. Your father's report has been waiting for supplementary documentation for 3 years, he said. What it needed was a qualified building inspection from a licensed contractor and corroborating financial analysis. He gestured at Wade's legal pad and at Dax's screen. We have both. We filed to the enforcement branch today with a simultaneous copy to the Attorney General, and we referenced Daniel's September 2021 initial report as the originating document of record. Nora said, so we finish it. Harlan said yes. Then Nora said, one more thing before we file. She had her phone in her hand and she was looking at it with the particular focused expression of someone who has been sitting with a piece of information and has decided the moment to use it has arrived. She put the phone on the table where everyone could see the screen. She had pulled up the university's public student directory and searched the name Baxter. One result in the student listings, Cody Baxter. She had then searched the name Baxter in the Billings municipal records, which were publicly available on the city's website. Clint Baxter, Chairman Housing Oversight Committee. She looked up. Cody Baxter is Clint Baxter's son. The kitchen went quiet in the specific way of a room absorbing something significant. Garrett looked at the 2 names on the screen. He looked at Nora. You've been sitting on this since last night, he said, not a question. Since I took the photograph, she said. I wasn't certain until I could search it properly this morning. I didn't want to say it before I was certain. She set the phone down. His son was in that diner. Baxter's son was the one who grabbed the sketchbook. Dax said very quietly, he knew whose daughter you were. I don't know if he knew, Nora said. I don't want to say more than I know. Maybe Cody was following me specifically. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe his father told him something, and maybe he just happened to be there. What I know is that it's a documented fact, that Cody Baxter is Clint Baxter's son, and that fact belongs in the filing alongside everything else. The committee can draw their own conclusions from the documented facts. Harlan nodded. It goes in as fact, not speculation. The connection between Cody Baxter and Clint Baxter is public record. The fact that Cody Baxter was the individual who harassed you in the diner, as documented by footage now in public circulation, is also public record. We present both facts and let the juxtaposition speak for itself. He opened his laptop. What happened in the next 4 hours at the Briggs kitchen table was not dramatic from the outside. It was 4 adults and one 16-year-old girl working through a document filing process with methodical precision, each person doing the portion of the work that was specifically theirs to do. Dax organized the financial records in the format the Attorney General's office required, building the numerical argument in the careful step-by-step structure of someone who had spent 18 years making financial evidence comprehensible to people who were not financial experts. Wade wrote his inspection findings in the formal language of his former certification, his observations translated from the quick shorthand of his legal pad notes into the precise professional language that carried weight in official proceedings. Harlan coordinated with his contact at the enforcement branch, walking the filing through its procedural requirements with the patience of someone who understood that procedure was not bureaucratic obstruction, but the mechanism by which informal knowledge becomes legal fact. And Nora provided the decoded content from Daniel's secondary files, translating her father's private alphabet into plain English, building the bridge between what Daniel had known and what could now be officially stated. 2 parts of the same work separated by 3 years and a November night in 2021, completed together at a kitchen table in February. June brought sandwiches at noon and put them on the table. No one stopped working to acknowledge them. They ate while they worked, and the afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor, and the work continued. At 2:15 in the afternoon, Harlan sent the filing. He set his phone down on the table and said, "It's in." Nora reached for her sketchbook. She opened it to a fresh page and began to draw. The others did not ask what she was drawing. They understood, each of them in their own way, that this was the thing she needed to do, with the feeling the moment had produced, and that the appropriate response was to give her the space to do it. The filing had gone in. The 3-year-old report that Daniel Briggs had submitted from his kitchen in September of 2021, trusting that the system would do what systems are supposed to do. That report was no longer waiting alone in a backlog. It had what it had needed all along. It had the rest of what Daniel had been trying to build before the Tuesday night in November had stopped him. She drew. The pencil moved on the page. Then Garrett's phone buzzed on the table. He looked at the message. He read it and set the phone down with a deliberateness that made Dax look up from his laptop. Baxter's attorneys have sent a letter to Iron Vale, Garrett said, alleging that members of the club intimidated students at the diner last night and that the club is subject to civil liability for creating a threatening environment. He paused, reading the rest. They're also claiming the footage was obtained without consent and is being used to defame a minor. The kitchen went quiet. One of the Iron Vale members who had been standing near the door, a man named Riggs, who had been with the club for 19 years and who maintained an expression that rarely changed regardless of what was happening in the room around him, looked at Garrett. "What do you want to do?" Garrett was quiet for a moment. He was aware of the weight of what he was holding, not just the legal threat, but the weight of 33 men who had come with him the previous night because they trusted his judgment. Men with families and livelihoods and reputations that could not afford to absorb what a protracted legal conflict with a connected local official could cost them. He was aware that the reasonable thing, the careful thing, the thing that protected his brothers was to step back. To let the state filing do what state filings do without Iron Vale's name attached to it. To separate the club from what was happening and let the official process run on its own. He looked at Nora. She was not looking at him, she was looking at her sketchbook. She had not put her pencil down. He looked at the drawing from the previous night that was still on the table between them. The two figures facing forward before the open territory. "We continue," he said. Riggs nodded once without hesitation. If Baxter wants to use his attorneys to come at Iron Vale instead of answering to the state for what's in those buildings, that tells us everything we need to know about which fight he thinks he can win, Garrett said. "We don't stop. We let Harlan coordinate with the state contacts. We let the filing do what it's going to do. And if Baxter's attorneys have paperwork they want to send, they can send it to our attorney who will read it carefully and respond in the appropriate way." Nora looked up from the sketchbook. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Garrett said. "Your father started this. We're finishing it." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her expression moved. Not softened exactly because it was not hard, but shifted the way a door shifts on its hinges when the weight of something passing through is different from what was expected. "My dad didn't wait for backup either," she said. "No, he never waited for anything he could already see needed doing." That afternoon, while the work continued at the kitchen table, Nora sent a single text to Sasha Holt. Not to schedule an interview. Just one line. "The student in the footage is Clint Baxter's son. No claim about what it meant. Just the documented fact offered to someone who would know what to do with it." Sasha replied, "In 4 minutes, I know. Working on it." Nora set her phone down and went back to her sketchbook. The response from the Montana Attorney General's office came 41 hours after the filing was submitted. Not the 72 hours Harlan had estimated as the optimistic end of a reasonable range. 41 hours, which is what happens when a formal filing arrives simultaneously with a news cycle that has already established the names and the context, when two separate streams of pressure converge on the same institutional attention and create together what neither could create alone. 41 hours, which was a Monday afternoon, gray and cold outside the kitchen window, the mountains invisible behind cloud. June received the call. She walked the length of the kitchen and back while she listened, and back again in the steady pacing she did when she was receiving something that required her full capacity to absorb, as if the motion helped the processing. Nora sat at the table with her sketchbook and tried to draw and mostly listened to her mother's side of the conversation, which was mostly silence with occasional single-syllable responses. The conversation of someone who is taking in a great deal of information and releasing very little of it. 22 minutes. Then June hung up. She stood at the window for a long moment with her hand on the counter, looking out at the gray afternoon, at the gray street, at the leafless tree in the yard that had been there since before they moved in and would be there long after. Then she turned around. They are opening a formal enforcement action, she said, both the Housing Division and the Attorney General's office, jointly. They confirmed that Daniel's initial filing in September 2021 is part of the official record of the case. She paused. They said the documentation submitted last week combined with his original report constitutes a complete evidentiary package. They said the original report was never closed. It was always part of the case. It just needed what we gave it. She looked at Nora. Her voice had changed in quality, the way a road changes when you cross from one kind of terrain into another, the surface different under you, even if you cannot yet name the difference. They are going to say his name, she said, in the official record. Daniel Briggs as the originator of the enforcement action. Nora set her pencil down. She was very still for a moment, looking at the table, at the pencil she had set down at the sketchbook open in front of her. Then she said, "He did it." June said, "You both did." "He started it," Nora said. "I finished it." Those are different contributions, and both of them mattered. But his mattered first. He did it first and alone when he didn't know if anyone was ever going to find out, when there was every reason to believe that the file would sit in a building 4 miles away for the rest of time and nothing would come of it. He did it anyway, that's the part that matters. She picked up her pencil. "He deserves to have originated it," she said. "That's the right word, originated. He did." She kept drawing. The formal hearing before the Billings Municipal Housing Oversight Committee was scheduled for a Tuesday in March, 3 weeks after the enforcement action was initiated. The snow had pulled back from the streets of Billings, by then retreating to the edges of parking lots and the north sides of buildings, the slow recession of a winter, releasing its grip on the spaces where daily life happens, even as it held on in the places where no one was watching. The sky over the mountains was the pale, specific blue of a Montana winter, ending the color of transition, of a season becoming something it is not yet fully committed to being. The committee room was on the 3rd floor of the municipal building on North 27th Street. Fluorescent lighting, institutional carpeting, the color of a decision no one remembered making. Folding chairs in rows facing a raised platform where the 5 committee members would sit. Not a courtroom. The authority here was administrative rather than judicial. But administrative authority at the right moment and in the right hands is not a smaller thing than judicial authority. It reaches into the structures of daily life and changes what is possible in them going forward. And sometimes that is more durable than what any court can accomplish, because it changes the ground people stand on, rather than just the verdict they receive. The room was full. Clint Baxter was there with 2 attorneys who wore the specific expression of attorneys who have been briefed thoroughly and are confident in their strategy. Baxter himself wore the charcoal suit he wore to things that mattered, the one that said, without saying it, that he was a man of substance and standing and measured and reasonable authority, the kind of man that communities need and reward. His face had the composed steadiness of a man who had managed difficult situations for 23 years, and who believed, based on 23 consecutive years of evidence, in his capacity to continue managing them. He had managed inspectors and loan officers and aldermen and the occasional aggressive reporter. He had managed for 4 years the gap between what his buildings were and what the paper said they were, and the gap had never closed on its own. He looked at the presenter's table when he walked in. He looked at the wheelchair beside it. Something moved across his face and was controlled before it arrived at anything that could be named or used. He looked at the papers in front of him and straightened them with deliberate precision. Dorothy Greer was in the 2nd row with a notebook and no press badge. Retired journalists covering things as private citizens retain the habits of working ones, and Dorothy's habit had always been to be in the room when the room was about to matter. Sasha Holt was in the 3rd row with a press badge and the expression of a 26-year-old journalist covering the biggest story of her career, with the combination of barely contained excitement and disciplined professionalism that defines the best ones, the ones who will still be at it in 30 years. The 34 members of Iron Veil occupied the back 3 rows. They had arrived before anyone else. They had come in quietly and taken their seats and had been sitting there when the committee members arrived, when Baxter's attorneys arrived, when the various officials and observers and citizens who had come because the story had been in the news for 3 weeks arrived and filled the available chairs. They had sat through all the arrival and settling without drawing attention to themselves, which for 34 men in leather cuts sitting in a government committee room was not an accident and was not a small thing. They were there to witness, not to testify, not to threaten, not to perform anything for anyone in the room. To be present in the way that presence purely itself constitutes a form of testimony that requires no words. June was in the front row on the left. She was wearing the dark blue blouse she kept for occasions, the one that had been worn to 3 job interviews and a school concert and Daniel's funeral, and nothing else in the years since. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was looking straight ahead. And from the presenter's table, Nora could see her mother's profile in the absolute stillness of it. The stillness of a woman who has decided to hold herself completely together for the duration of whatever was about to happen and would deal with whatever the holding cost her afterward in private when no one needed her to be anything specific. Nora was at the presenter's table. She had the binder Harlan had organized, Wade's inspection reports formatted and tabbed, Dax's financial analysis structured for a non-specialist audience, Daniel's photographs printed at high resolution and labeled by building and date, her own schematics, the building layouts she had drawn from memory during the months when she had been following her mother on maintenance calls without knowing she was making a record annotated now, with Wade's corresponding field observations. And the sketchbook was on the table in front of her, not because it was part of the official filing, but because it had been in her hands through all of it, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. The committee chair called the session to order at 9 o'clock. The first 40 minutes were procedural. Baxter's attorneys raised 2 objections in the formal language of attorneys who are attempting to create procedural obstacles, in the hope that enough obstacles will discourage the process from continuing. The chair noted both objections, consulted the committee's legal advisor briefly for each one, and set both aside with the minimal language of someone who has heard this particular category of maneuver before and is not going to give it more attention than it deserves. Then the chair said, "We'll hear from the party who submitted the supplementary filing." Nora rolled forward to the microphone. It was at podium height, which was the wrong height for someone in a wheelchair. She adjusted it herself without hurry, without visible frustration, with the practiced efficiency of someone who has spent 3 years operating in a world built for a body different from hers, and has become very good at making the adjustments without making them the subject of the moment. No one moved to help her. She did not look like someone who wanted help. She got the microphone where she needed it, and she looked at the committee members, each of them in turn. "My name is Nora Briggs," she said. "I am 16 years old. My father was Daniel Briggs. He was a resident of this city, and he found something that the people of this city deserve to know about, and he started the process of making that known, and then he died before he could finish it." She paused for a moment. "I finished it," she said. "I want to be clear about what I mean by that, because the documentation you've received reflects work done by several people, and I don't want there to be any confusion about who did what and when. My father found the original evidence and kept the records and filed the initial report with the state in September 2021. I decoded the additional documentation he left behind, provided the building schematics, and worked with the men who conducted the formal inspections and financial analysis to compile the supplementary filings submitted last week. My father and I did this work together. He did his part in 2021. I did mine in February of this year. The 3 years between those 2 dates are not my work and not his work. They are a gap, and I want this committee to understand that clearly." She looked at the committee members, each of them in turn. In those 3 years, 11 buildings in this city continued to be rented to families at full market rate, while their inspection records stated something that was not true, she said. Those families, the people in them, the children sleeping in those apartments, they did not know what was in the walls. They had no reason not to trust the paperwork. They trusted it because we build systems so that people can trust paperwork, so that they don't have to inspect the walls themselves. They trusted it because that is what paperwork is for. The paperwork is the promise. She opened the binder. "When the paperwork lies, the promise lies," she said. "I want to go through what Daniel Briggs found and what the men who worked with his documentation found building by building." She went through it for 45 minutes. She did not editorialize. She did not use language designed to create emotional responses. She did not need to, because the sequence itself was the argument, and the argument was sufficient. Each building in turn, the official inspection record, the date it claimed the name of the inspector, whose signature appeared on it, the documentation of what was actually present in that building when Wade Flynn visited it in February. the moisture damage in the supporting walls, the electrical irregularities that created fire risked the carbon monoxide readings from the heating systems. Each property, the certified value on the official record, the refinancing instrument executed against that certified value, the calculation of what the property would actually have been worth if its true condition had been disclosed to the lender. When she reached the section on Gerald Fossey, she said, "The inspector whose signature appears on this November 2021 document, the document certifying compliance for Building 7 on the list, is Gerald Fossey. Mr. Fossey's inspector identification number appears on 6 documents in the filing. Mr. Fossey died in August 2021, 3 months before the date on this document. I have included the death certificate in the appendix tab 11. She read the dates in the same measured voice she had used throughout. She did not look at Clint Baxter. One of the committee members, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses, and the specific expression of someone who has been doing this work for a long time and thought she had seen most of what there was to see, looked at the page in her copy of the binder for a long time. She looked at the signature. She looked at the date on the document. She looked at the date annotated below it in Nora's handwriting. Gerald Fossey, deceased August 14th, 2021. She did not speak. She just looked, with the quality of someone whose understanding of what they are looking at has changed completely and irrevocably. At the presenter's table, Clint Baxter's left hand, which had been resting on the table, moved slightly. His attorney leaned toward him and said something in a voice too low for anyone else to hear. Baxter nodded. He looked at the table in front of him. He looked at his hands. He did not look up at the committee. He did not look up at the presenter's table. He looked at his hands. When Nora reached the section on Daniel's initial report, she said, "My father submitted this report to the State Enforcement Branch in September 2021. He was told it was received and under review. He died 2 months later. The file was transferred to a new officer managing a backlog of 600 open cases and waited for supplementary documentation. The documentation it needed was Wade Flynn's field inspection and Dax Mercer's financial analysis completed in February of this year. Both men are members of Ironvale MC. They completed their work in less than 24 hours from the time I asked for their help." She closed the binder. She set her hand on the sketchbook in front of her. "My father was an electrician," she said. "He was not a lawyer or a licensed building inspector or a forensic accountant. He was a man who did good work and paid close attention and had the kind of conscience that could not set something down once he had picked it up. He found what he found by accident in a utility closet where a file box had no business being, and once he found it, he spent 14 months building a record while working full-time and raising a family. He filed his report in September 2021. Then he died. And the report sat in a building 4 miles from our house while my mother worked double shifts to keep us in that house, and Clint Baxter refinanced his properties against inspections that never happened." She looked at the committee. "I am not asking this committee for anything on my own behalf," she said. "I am not asking for anything for my family. I am asking that the record be corrected, that the families in those 11 buildings be notified of the actual condition of their homes and protected accordingly, that the enforcement process my father initiated be completed, and that the record of these proceedings state formally that Daniel Briggs originated this case." She paused. "He deserves to have originated it," she said, "in writing officially. He did the hardest part, which was to notice in the first place, and then to decide that noticing was not enough." She rolled back from the microphone. The room was very quiet. In the back 3 rows, 34 men in leather cuts did not move and did not speak. They sat in the particular stillness of people who are doing the most important thing possible in this moment, which is to be present, to be counted among those who came to be part of the record of who was there when it happened. In the front row, June Briggs looked at her daughter with an expression that would have broken anyone who saw it clearly, and it did not break anything because it did not need to. At the presenter's table, Nora opened her sketchbook and picked up her pencil. Not performing steadiness, just needing her hands to be doing something while the room absorbed what it had been told. Clint Baxter sat with his attorneys. He looked at the table in front of him and the papers there. One of his attorneys wrote something on a legal pad and slid it toward him, and he read it and looked at the table again. He was a man who had managed difficult situations for 23 years. He was discovering that this was not a situation that would be managed. The committee went into closed session at 11:40 and returned at 1:50. The chair read a statement in 4 paragraphs. The first paragraph initiated formal enforcement proceedings against all 11 properties requiring immediate structural assessment and remediation to be completed at the property owner's expense before continued occupancy could be certified as safe. The second paragraph referred the complete financial documentation to the Montana Attorney General for independent investigation into potential mortgage fraud and material misrepresentation in commercial lending. The third paragraph suspended Clint Baxter from his position as chairman of the Housing Oversight Committee, effective immediately pending the outcome of the enforcement and criminal referral processes. The fourth paragraph was the shortest of the four. The chair read it with the slight additional weight of someone who knows a particular sentence will outlast the proceeding. It appears in Who Understands that some things said in official rooms become part of what the room means forever afterward. It said the committee formally acknowledged the initial housing safety complaint filed by Daniel Briggs in September 2021 as the originating document of the enforcement case designated in these proceedings and entered his name into the official record accordingly. His name was in the record, officially, permanently, in the building where decisions about this city were made and kept and remained. Nora sat at the presenter's table with her hand on the sketchbook and looked at the middle distance. She stayed there for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she opened the sketchbook and looked at the drawings she had been working on through the session, the two figures facing forward at the open territory before them, and she picked up her pencil. She drew a third figure. Behind the two large ones, smaller but upright, not hiding, not waiting, standing. Present. She looked at the drawing for a moment. Then she looked up and across the room to where Garrett was already moving down from the back rows toward the presenter's table, making his way through the people beginning to stand and gather their thing, moving with the unhurried directness of a man who knows exactly where he is going and has been heading there for longer than he realized. He stopped at the edge of the table. He looked at the drawing, at the three figures, at the one she had just added, and he looked at it for a long time without speaking. "Your father should have been here for this," he said. "He was," Nora said. "He was here the whole time. He just had to be here through me." June reached them then, and she took Nora's hand, and the three of them stood together in the quiet of the room while around them, the formal proceeding dissolved back into ordinary life, people gathering papers and saying things to each other. The ordinary sounds of an official moment becoming past tense. Garrett said, "I'd like to come back, not to manage anything, not to take care of anything that doesn't need taking care of, just to come back." June looked at him. The same direct assessing gaze she had used in the diner the night of the storm, checking for the thing that mattered underneath the thing being said. She held it for a long moment. "Every Sunday," she said, "dinner, 6 o'clock. You help with the dishes." 3 weeks after the hearing on a Saturday morning, when the first real warmth of spring was beginning to soften the edge of things in Billings. Not the warmth of full spring, but the tentative warmth of a season testing what it could do. Wade Flynn and 6 members of Iron Vale arrived at the Briggs house on Cascade Street with lumber and hardware and a set of measurements that Harlan Boone had worked out on a yellow legal pad in the parking lot of the diner 2 days earlier. The wheelchair ramp was the thing Daniel had told June he would build the spring after Nora's accident. He had said it with the particular confidence of a man who is good with his hands and has looked at a problem and already seen the solution, who is simply waiting for the right weekend and the right weather. He had bought the materials. They were in the garage, stacked against the back wall in the careful arrangement of a man who intends to use something and is keeping it in good order until he can. 2x6 framing, lumber-treated deck boards for the surface, a box of structural screws, the hardware for the handrail brackets. Still in the original wrapping in most cases, 3 years of right weekends had come and gone without the right weekend arriving. Wade found the materials when he came into the garage, and he ran his hand along the lumber and said without looking up, he bought good stock. He said it the way a person says something true and specific that is also on another level about something else entirely. Then they used it to finish what had been started with what had been prepared for it. Nora sat on the porch in the cool morning air and watched them work. She did not offer to help because she was not going to be able to help with this particular task, and she was not going to perform the offering. She watched the way she watched most things, carefully taking in the angles and the light and the specific movements of people doing work they knew how to do, the economical gestures of competence, the way experienced hands move through familiar problems without wasted motion. She drew the 7 men working in the early spring light. She drew the way the light hit Wade's shoulders when he bent over the frame. She drew the particular angle of the ramp taking shape between the porch and the ground, the geometry of a thing designed to connect a height to the earth in a way that gave you the resistance to know you were moving under your own power that asked something of you rather than doing everything for you. She drew the lumber that her father had chosen and bought and stacked in the garage for a spring that had not come for him, and she drew it now as what it was becoming, which was the thing he had intended it to be. It was not a sad drawing. She was aware of this as she made it. It was not sad exactly because the thing being made was right, was the correct completion of a thing that had been left incomplete. And the rightness of it was the dominant quality, the thing that gave the drawing its feeling. The ramp took 4 hours. When it was finished, Wade walked the full length of it with a level checking the grade with the methodical attention of someone who has been building things long enough to know that the work is not finished until you have checked it yourself and are satisfied. He ran his eye along the edge, the way experienced builders run their eyes along finished work, looking for what is not right so it can be made right before anyone else uses it. He found nothing that needed correcting. He stood at the bottom and looked up at Nora on the porch. She rolled to the top of the ramp. She looked down the slope at the grade Harlan had calculated and Wade had built. It was exactly right. She could feel the rightness of it before she moved on to it, the specific angle that promised the resistance she wanted. The work of going forward, the push against the incline, the knowledge in her shoulders and her hands that she was moving under her own power and not being carried. She rolled down. At the bottom, she stopped and turned and looked up at the house. She had lived there her whole life. She had looked at it from every angle available to a person who lives in a place, had accumulated over the years all the different views of it from all the different positions a daily life creates. She had stopped seeing it the way you stop seeing the things that are always there, that become part of the air around you rather than objects in the world. She saw it now. It looked complete, not more beautiful than it had been, not larger, just the specific rightness of a thing that has been waiting for its last piece and has finally received it. A thing that is now what it was supposed to be. Garrett arrived for the first Sunday dinner at exactly 6 o'clock. He had brought nothing because June had told him not to bring anything, and he had listened, which was already something. He sat at the kitchen table in the chair where Daniel Briggs had sat on Sunday mornings for 12 years, and he did not try to fill the specific gravity of that space, did not try to be what the chair had contained before. He managed it by simply being himself without apology for the ways he was not the person who used to sit there, without performing either ease or difficulty. June made pot roast with potatoes and carrots and the particular heavy gravy that requires patience and did not apologize for the simplicity of it, which meant she had already decided he was not a guest to be performed for, but a person to be fed, and that the distinction mattered. The dinner was not difficult. It was not easy either exactly. It was honest, which was the thing that it needed to be, and honesty has a quality of ease inside it. Once the pretending stops, once everyone in the room has agreed to be in the same room with what is actually true. After dinner, Garrett washed the dishes. He stood at the sink and washed, and Nora dried, which had been her job since she was 9 years old, and was executed now with a sideways reach. She had worked out in the first months after the accident and had not thought about since. A reach that had become simply the way she dried dishes, in the same way that everything she did now was simply the way she did it, integrated and automatic. The past adjustment, invisible inside the present motion. They did not talk much while they worked. The kitchen was warm. The evening light came through the window over the sink at the specific angle of early spring, lasting past the point where you expected to end the days stretching out the way they do in March, tentatively, at first, and then with increasing confidence. At some point, Nora said without looking up from the plate she was drying, he made the right call. Garrett was quiet for a moment, understanding what she meant. Asking me. Trusting you, she said. He was a good judge of people. He always was. He saw things in people before those people saw them in themselves. Garrett set the next dish in the drying rack and did not say anything for a moment. He saw someone who would show up, Nora said. Even if it took a while. It took too long. You're here now, she said. That's the part that counts. That's the part that changes things. She folded the dish towel over the oven handle in the position that was somewhere between her mother's way and her father's way. Her mother folded it once neat and flat. Her father folded it twice the way he had learned in the army, where storage space was limited, and which she had settled into years ago without knowing she was doing it, without deciding the way children unconsciously carry forward the gestures of the people they have lived with. She rolled to the table. Her sketchbook was there. She opened it to the drawing she had finished the night before, the one she had been working towards since the night in the diner, the one she had needed to do in stages because each stage required the previous one to be completed first. The two figures facing forward, the third figure behind them, upright present, and behind all three the road, the long, flat road running north through Montana, the mountains at the edges, the sky going on, the center line disappearing into the distance, the way roads do when they are going somewhere you cannot see yet but are heading toward. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned to a fresh page and began to draw again. The hands wanted to keep going. There was always another thing, always the next thing the hands were reaching toward. Outside on the street in front of the house, 6 motorcycles were parked in a row. The Iron Veil members who had ridden with Garrett sat on their bikes or stood beside them in the easy outdoor patience of men who are comfortable in cool weather, talking in the low tones of people with nothing urgent to say and nowhere else they need to be. In the kitchen, June was reading at the table with her reading glasses and her tea. Garrett was drying his hands on the dish towel. The kitchen light was the specific warm yellow of a room being used correctly, a room that is warm and occupied and doing what a kitchen is for, which is not the cooking, but the being in together. Nora drew. In the months that followed, the enforcement action moved through the stages of enforcement actions in the way that official processes move, which is slowly but without stopping, each step producing the conditions for the next step, in a sequence that once begun does not easily reverse itself. The 11 buildings were assessed by the state's contracted inspectors. The assessment findings were consistent with Wade's field observations. The tenants in 3 of the buildings were temporarily relocated at Baxter's expense while structural remediation was completed. The other 8 buildings required less extensive work, but work nonetheless, the repair of things that had been allowed to deteriorate because no one in a position to require repair had been looking. The tenants were notified of the actual condition of their homes. Most of them were not surprised. The ones who had been surprised were the ones who had trusted the paperwork completely, who had believed that the system worked the way it was supposed to work. Some of them were very angry. That was appropriate. Dax's financial analysis, reviewed and expanded by the Attorney General's office, established the full scope of the refinancing fraud. The total figure was higher than his initial estimate. Clint Baxter's attorneys made several attempts at negotiation during the months the investigation ran. The Attorney General's office was not interested in negotiation. They were interested in prosecution. The formal charges were filed in late April. Wire fraud, bank fraud, filing false public records, and 4 additional counts. Baxter resigned from the Housing Oversight Committee before the filing was complete. His resignation was received and accepted. The State Housing Enforcement Division, in conjunction with the Attorney General's report, developed a new verification protocol for residential property inspections in Montana. The protocol required cross-referencing inspector signatures against the state's active inspector registry before any certification could be finalized. The document establishing the protocol noted in its preamble that the need for the protocol had been identified through the investigation of case number 24-HB-0041, originating complaint filed September 2021 by Daniel Briggs. His name was in the protocol in a document that would be used going forward that would require his name to appear every time someone referenced the regulation that came from what he had found. Nora read this when Harlan sent her a copy of the protocol document sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in May with the window open and the first real warmth of spring coming through it. She read the preamble twice. Then she set the document down and sat with it for a while. Then she opened her sketchbook and drew. She drew her father as she remembered him from the Sunday mornings. From behind the way she had always drawn the figure, she could not see the face of the broad shoulders and the dark hair before it went gray. The particular posture of someone sitting at a table with a pencil in his hand, looking at a drawing he is holding up to the window. She drew it until it was right. Then she drew herself beside him. Both of them at the table, both looking at the drawing held up to the light, both seeing the lines go honest against the brightness. She looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she closed the sketchbook and set her pencil down and sat in the kitchen with the window open and the warm May air coming through and the sound of motorcycles several blocks away, the low, steady sound of Iron Veil returning from a Saturday morning ride coming home. One Sunday afternoon in early June, Nora went into the garage looking for a box of her father's old photographs that June had mentioned seeing somewhere near the back wall. She did not find the photographs immediately. She found instead a sketchbook she did not recognize. It was in a plastic bin on the shelf above where the ramped lumber had been stacked. She recognized her father's handwriting on the cover label, a date from 7 years ago, and she opened it with the particular carefulness of someone handling something that was not meant to be handled carelessly. Her father had been drawing too. The first dozen pages were mechanical drawings, engines, brake systems, the detailed technical schematics of someone working through a problem on paper. Then there were drawings of the house, various angles, and renovation ideas that had never been executed. And then beginning about a third of the way through the sketchbook and continuing to the last page were drawings of Nora. Not her face, never her face directly, always from behind or at an angle or at a distance. The back of her head at the kitchen table, her hands on the paper in front of her, the particular angle of her shoulders when she was concentrating on a drawing, her at the window, her in the yard, her sitting on the porch in the evening with the light behind her. He had been drawing her the way she had been drawing him, without knowing who the figure was, without being able to see the face, just the posture, the presence, the specific quality of someone doing the thing they were made for. She sat in the garage for a long time with the sketchbook open in her hands. She thought about the Sunday mornings, the pencil in his hand, the window light. She thought about two people sitting at the same table drawing the same thing, each other from behind without knowing the other was doing the same, each of them reaching towards something they could feel but could not quite see. She thought about the alphabet he had built into her memory disguised as a game, the logo she had drawn without knowing it was the real version, the envelope sealed and waiting, the filing that had waited 3 years for the supplementary documentation that she and the men of Iron Vale had assembled in 24 hours. She thought about the way he had organized everything around the possibility that something might happen to him. Not because he knew it would not, because he was afraid, but because some things were too important to leave unprepared. And the act of preparation was itself a form of care, a way of saying, I am thinking about you, even in the contingencies I hope will never arrive. She closed the sketchbook carefully and held it in her lap and looked at the back wall of the garage where the ramped lumber had been stacked for 3 years. She understood sitting there that the drawing she had been making for 3 years, the big figure arms slightly out, the child barely visible behind, was not a drawing of Garrett Donovan. It had never been exclusively a drawing of Garrett Donovan. It was a drawing of her father doing what he had spent his life doing, positioning himself between her and whatever was coming, preparing the ground for her, trusting that what he built would find its way to where it needed to go. And it had. She went back inside with the sketchbook and showed it to June, who sat at the kitchen table and looked at the drawings of Nora without saying anything for a long time. Then she said, he used to do that on Sunday mornings. I thought he was working on house plans. He was working on house plans, Nora said, and also this. June looked at the last drawing in the sketchbook. Nora from behind at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, the window light coming through at the angle it always came through on Sunday mornings. He was looking at you, looking at your work, June said. He was looking at you the way you looked at what you were drawing. Nora set the sketchbook on the table and looked at it. I know, she said. That evening at dinner, it was Sunday. Garrett was there, the pot roast was June's. The dishes would need to be done after. Nora showed Garrett the sketchbook. He looked through it slowly in the particular way he looked at things that mattered, without hurrying, giving each page the time it required. When he reached the last drawing, he was quiet for a long time. He was always paying attention, he said finally. Yes, Nora said. That was the thing about him. In the field and all of it. He paid attention to the things most people let slide past. He caught things. He looked at the drawing of Nora at the kitchen table. He was paying attention to you. We were paying attention to each other, Nora said. We just didn't know we were doing the same thing. She took the sketchbook back and set it on the table beside her own. 2 sketchbooks side by side. 2 people who had been drawing the same thing from different sides of the same table, reaching toward each other in the only language they both fully shared, the language of lines on paper of the thing rendered precisely enough to keep it. The following Saturday morning, Nora was at Crossroads Diner at 8 o'clock. She had been coming every Saturday since February. It had become the shape of Saturday mornings, the thing that the morning was organized around the drive, down Route 3, the corner booth, the coffee, and the milkshake, that arrived in the same order every time the sketchbook opened on the table, the pencil moving. Paulette had put the drawing Nora left, the motorcycle and pencil on a napkin, up on the board above the pass-through window. It was still there between the child's crayon truck and the 1987 photograph. Paulette had not asked Nora about it. Nora had not commented on it. It was simply there, which was the right way for it to be. This Saturday morning, Dorothy Greer was in the second booth from the back with her notebook and her coffee and the particular quality of attentiveness that had made her a good journalist for 31 years and had not gone away when she stopped being one officially. She had been coming on Saturday mornings too since March, since the hearing. She did not always talk to Nora. Sometimes she just sat in her booth and wrote in her notebook. And Nora sat in her corner booth and drew in her sketchbook, and the diner was warm around them both. Outside, the June morning was clear and bright, the mountains visible all the way to the snow line, the sky, the deep, specific blue of a Montana summer that has actually arrived and committed, that is no longer becoming, but simply is. 34 motorcycles were in the parking lot. They had been there when she arrived. They would be there when she left. On Saturday mornings, Iron Vale came to Crossroads the way she came to Crossroads, because it was where they came, because it had become that, because the morning required it. Garrett was at the counter with coffee and the quiet that was simply his, the quality of presence that did not need anything from the room around it to be complete. Nora drew. She drew the road she had finally learned to draw, the one running north out of Billings through the valley, the mountains on both sides, the sky enormous above it. She drew it with the figures in it that she now knew how to draw, all three of them, the two large and the one smaller, all facing forward, all present, all of them on the road together. She drew it until it was right. Then she looked up from the sketchbook and out the window at the morning and the park bikes and the specific quality of light on chrome in the early June air, the light of a season that had arrived and intended to stay. Paulette came by with more coffee, set it down without a word, walked away before anything needed to be said. Nora looked at the drawing. She looked at the three figures on the road all facing forward into the territory ahead. She looked at the mountains on either side and the sky above and the center line running out to the horizon. She understood, looking at it, what the drawing had always been about, what the 3 years of the same figure from the same angle without the face had been leading toward. Not a portrait, not a record, not even exactly a memorial, though it was that too. It was a map, a record of where they all were together on the road, a record of who had come and who was here and what was ahead. She closed the sketchbook and set it on the table and picked up the milkshake. She had not asked for it. She never asked for it. It arrived because Paulette knew what Saturday morning was, knew what the corner booth was, knew what it meant to have a place in the world that was yours and to come back to it every week without being asked. The presence of someone who comes back. That was what she had been drawing for 3 years and what she understood now, clearly sitting in the corner booth of Crossroads Diner on a Saturday morning in June, with the mountains visible and the motorcycles in the parking lot and her sketchbook on the table and the pencil that had been her father's in her hand. Not the posture of protection, not the posture of threat, the posture of someone who has decided to be somewhere and has kept that decision through everything, through the years and the distance and the reasons not to, through the weight of what the coming required and the weight of what the not coming had cost. The posture of someone who came back. Her father had built the envelope and the drive and the alphabet and the ramp lumber in the garage. He had built it all and trusted it to find its way. And it had found its way in the February night, in the corner booth, and the sketchbook turned around on the table, and the 4 words on the inside cover that said, "For the road ahead." For the road ahead he had written, as if he knew there would be a road, as if he was sure of it. She picked up her pencil and opened the sketchbook to a fresh page. She began to draw. Outside, the Montana morning was clear and bright, and going on the way Montana mornings go on. Enormous and specific and full of the particular quality of a place that does not apologize for what it is, that is what it is, completely and without modification. The sky above the mountains was the deep committed blue of a summer that has arrived. The engines in the parking lot were quiet. The street was still. Inside, the diner was warm and occupied and doing what diners do on Saturday mornings, which is hold the people who come to them. The ones who come back week after week to the same booth, the same coffee, the same corner of the room where the light comes in at the right angle and the world outside is visible through the fogged, or clear or rain-streaked window, and the hands can do what the hands need to do. Nora drew. The pencil moved on the page. That was the thing. That was what it had always been. The hands moving the lines, going down the shape of things, becoming visible on the page. The road and the figures on it, and the sky above them, and the mountains at the edges, and the space ahead that was not yet decided but was already organized around the people who were heading into it. She drew until it was right. Then she set the pencil down and looked out the window at the morning. The presence of someone who comes back. That was the drawing. That had always been the drawing. She picked up the milkshake. Outside, a motorcycle engine turned over somewhere down the street. Then another, the sound of iron veil getting ready to ride, the low collective note of engines warming up the sound that had pressed against the windows of this diner on a February night and changed what everything meant. She listened to it. Then she picked up her pencil and kept drawing because there was always more, because the hands were always ahead of the rest of her, always reaching toward the next thing that needed to exist. The road went on.